Do you think the whole Street Fighter 6 drive system is too complicated?
It's difficult to say, but I would assume that it will be very overwhelming when the game comes out. There's definitely a lot to it.
I hear a lot of people concerned about it, especially when we're doing our recent breakdown videos. And I do understand why there's a concern because there's so many weird nuances that we're learning every day looking at the footage and a lot of specific things that are just tied to the drive gauge itself, especially the whole burnout mode and what that brings to the table as well, you know?
I feel like the number of mechanics tied to the drive gauge, they are something that people are going to get used to relatively quickly. But the fact that the drive gauge doesn't operate like any meter that we've seen in Street Fighter before, that's probably what will take people most time to get used to.
You know what's funny though? On the first day, everyone's just gonna be spamming drive impact anyways. You know,
Oh
like
yeah,
what
absolutely.
I mean, like you can tell just by looking at all the journalist footage. Like that is the main thing everyone is doing. Is like you see drive impact being used like every 3 seconds because it's easy to use. It's just two buttons, and it's very effective if it lands, and it requires you to have good knowledge of the game to stop it. So just everyone's just using it. It gives you a free combo. You know.
Mhm. Also looks cool. I think that's like what a lot of people
Yeah, I
think
guess it
about it.
looks cool too. Yeah, there's that, and then the whole burnout mode and understanding the chip, and then the how dangerous the corner is. That could be really overwhelming. So it once again, it's kind of funny. Like there's so many things in Street Fighter 6 that they're helping bring a lot of players into this game, like casual or beginners or people that don't play fighting games. But there's
Mhm.
also a lot of things that still make it complicated as a fighting game as well.
I would say the thing that people will find a little bit harder to implement, like you said, drive impact is pretty simple to understand, and overdrives, EX moves basically. So those are pretty easy. Are the other defensive mechanics like the drive reversal? I have this feeling that it's going to be really, really useful, even though it's 2 bars of drive. I think we're going to see more and more of that as the game becomes older and older. I feel like it's the kind of mechanic that it's just so useful, but no one uses it because it's quote unquote boring, right?
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, Mirror, because my brother, I'm trying to explain to him how powerful V reversal is in Street Fighter 5 because
Hmm.
he's dealing with a lot of situations where characters are really plus, like Akira, her new like everyone's using V Trigger 2 with Akira now because that got buffed, and she's doing
Yeah.
like her rekkas that make her safe. And or when my brother goes like a Bison and he's doing like EX knee press, right? Or cycle
Yes.
axe down forward heavy punch. And I'm like, the thing about these moves, like even though they're super plus and they're powerful, it's a guaranteed V reversal. It's a guaranteed
Yeah.
knockdown, guaranteed grade damage. And it's the same in Street Fighter 6. They still take grade damage, it still knocks them away, and you even gain some of your drive gauge back when you land it.
Hmm.
And the difference is that the reason my brother in particular doesn't like using V reversal is because in his brain it's like, well, I'm giving up my V trigger to do it, right? It's
Yeah.
like if I use this, I can't use my V trigger. My V trigger is my most powerful thing, so why would I want to use this weaker thing? But in Street
Hmm.
Fighter 6, we don't have that you don't have to make that kind of decision. It's just based on how much meter you're willing to use.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And on top of that, drive as opposed to the V gauge is just basically regenerating resource, right? Like the V
Yeah.
gauge essentially is tied to your health, and if you're able to land your V skill, which not every character can do, especially
Hmm.
if they have a defensive V skill. You have a limited amount of V gauge, but technically, as long as there's seconds in the round, you could have almost an unlimited amount of drive, right? So it rewards you for being on the offense as well. You get drive faster,
Hmm.
drive back faster. So that's probably going to make people want to spend drive a little bit more liberally. Although I predict the maybe the opposite problem where instead of people being too stingy on drive, they will overspend their drive constantly and
Oh,
going to
you're
burn
right.
accidentally. Like especially early
100%.
on, that's gonna happen so much.
I can already see like a future YouTube video on our channel that says the reason you're losing, and it shows like the burnout like
Yeah.
symbol. I can already see us doing a video on that in the future. I think you're definitely called it on that. But okay, let's think about Street Fighter 5 for a second. Like, what is complicated in Street Fighter 5 in general? Like, do you think the V skills are complicated? Like, what I mean is like, if you just start the game and you don't know anyone's V skills, what they do, can be kind of overwhelming because then you have Ryu and Gil where they have parries. This is some mechanic
Hmm.
that's just to them.
Yeah.
There's like characters that have stocks where it'll buff up like a certain move that you don't know that it buffs. Zangief has armor. There's a lot of
Hmm.
like weird kind of mechanics that are just tied to the character, just on V
Yeah.
skill.
Well, I guess the other problem is that everything is just poorly explained. Like, for example, you were talking about Zengi's armor, right? And he has a couple of armor moves. Like, a standing heavy punch, for example, doesn't have armor around his feet.
Yeah.
But there's no reason why it shouldn't, except the fact that just that move is built that way. But the
Yeah.
game doesn't tell you that. You have to find out yourself. Because, for example, his V skill, it has more than one hit of armor, and that's around the legs too. So it's like, where's the consistency? So in that sense, yeah, just the game is really bad at telling you what is
Oh,
going on.
dude, yeah, yeah, you're right. You know, another thing that bugs me, this is not VSCO related, but the fact when once again, my brother, he was having problems dealing with Dawson teleporting on Wake Up every time. And he's
Yeah,
like, is he invincible? I'm like, he is, but he's not throw invincible. You can throw him. But think about how dumb that sounds. Like, he's literally teleporting. Like, how would you know he's not throw invincible unless you tried it? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
and then, we talk about the Street Fighter, the Street Fighter 6 move list, they're amazing. It's like a big little mini
Mhm.
not encyclopedia, but a mini like a really poorly written strategy guide where it'll give you, some basic things on what they're for. Like they'll explain that, hey, this target combo is different than this one because it's safer on block on the second hit, or this is special cancelable. You know?
Yeah. Guilty Gear did a similar thing with
Oh, did
the
they?
video demonstration as well. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's
So,
really good, especially since it
yeah.
shows it. Like she shows it. Does it show in Guilty Gear too? Like what it's
Yes,
talking
yeah,
about?
it does have a little video. Definitely in Strive. I don't remember if XR had the little video as well.
We also had some footage mirror where they were showing the menu screen before they went to the character selection,
Mhm.
and they showed like some stuff on like arcade but on the VS screen, I forgot which menu it was. They showed off that the training mode, but there was also they showed there's combo trials in the game,
Yeah.
and there's a character guide section in the game as well.
Mhm.
And man, the Street Fighter Five, what was it called? Those tutorials,
Missions? Character missions? I don't quite remember,
not the
actually.
trials, unless that's what you're talking about. I'm talking about the
Yeah, no, I know what you're
demonstrations.
trying to talk about. It's like
Demonstrations.
those little bit like those mini
Oh,
tutorials that kinda, like, explain the
horrible.
basics of what the
Yeah.
character is like.
Oh, they're horrible. So,
They're just not enough, I think. Like, what the information that is in there is valuable, but it's just, you're not gonna be able to understand how to most effectively play your character just based on that.
yeah.
It's just too basic, and it doesn't necessarily give you all the keys to understanding. Like,
Yeah.
for example, remember as we were talking about armor, I'm pretty sure that it doesn't tell you, say, for example, how many hits of armor this move has, and it could be really important to know if you're playing against that character. And
Mhm.
so there's like this reliance on having to go and find that out by yourself, which maybe old veterans of the genre, then they won't have problems with that because they're used to it by now. But someone that's new or plays other games, they're right to say that that's kind of dumb because it's like other games would tell you how it works. So why is it the fighting games are so unintuitive, right?
Yeah, you have to really emphasize with the fact that like we played so many Street Fighter games, so we kind of know it going in. But if you start from scratch, you know,
Oh yeah. You
it
come
would
from
suck.
another genre.
Yeah, it would be really confused. What else is complicated about Street Fighter Five?
I guess the most obvious thing that comes to mind is that it's really important to know frame data, but we don't quite are not.
Yeah.
I guess we aren't quite sure on how it's going to be in Street Fighter 6 because it could just
Hmm.
be the same. It's just that it seems like, at least on a surface level, in Street Fighter 6, there's just so many defensive options that you might not have to necessarily know about every situation as in depth as you need in Street Fighter 5 just because you have more ways out of it, you know?
Right. It's like, okay, well, how minus am I, or how plus is he? And you realize it's not your turn. You realize it's still their turn. But then you're like, in Street Fighter 6, you're like, okay, well, if he does this move again, I'm just gonna drive impact it rather than be
Yeah.
like, what's the correct way to avoid this move? And drive impact is universal. Every character is gonna have this tool, so every character can deal with it the same way. Like if
Hmm.
it's a Honda headbutt or something. And the
Yeah.
same thing with projectiles with parry. It's the same concept, right? It's like,
Yeah,
how do I
yeah,
get around
absolutely.
this? I could just parry to build drive gauge, so that kind of makes it easier to understand, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, or moves that, like are reactable. If you don't know how punishable they are, well, you're guaranteed that if you get a perfect parry, for example, because they are reactable, right? And you're good enough to at least get the timing down,
Yeah,
that you're guaranteed a punish regardless.
yeah.
For example, that's a That's another thing. Or I mean, even if you get a random drive parry, like a perfect parry in neutral, you're guaranteed to just get something out of that. You don't need to know what it is that you parried. At least I would assume for the most part it's going to be that way. There's going
Yeah.
to be exceptions for sure.
You know what's funny? I've seen a lot of people compare the drive gauge to the Mortal Kombat 11 bar. Like they're saying they copied it, like straight up copied Mortal Kombat. What do you think about
I
that?
mean, okay, so the obvious parallel that people are drawing here is that they both recharge over time, right?
Yes.
But
Don't they? Yeah, they do.
they do.
Okay.
But clearly the difference or rather the similarities they kind of just end there, I guess. Because the Mortal Kombat, for example, has both an offensive and a defensive bar, while Street Fighter obviously has just a single drive bar.
Okay.
There's no way for the opponent to interact with your bar in the Mortal Kombat, as far as I'm aware. Like they cannot drain your
Oh yeah,
defensive
yeah.
bar, or they
Yeah.
cannot drain your offensive bar, which is obviously the point of drive, right? That's the way it works
Right.
in Street Fighter. In Street Fighter, if you want to use a defensive mechanic, right? Like for example, parry, drive reversal, whatever, it's going to tap into the same resource that you also use for offense, drive rush, ODs, and etc.
Yeah.
While in Mortal Kombat, they're completely separate. So I don't think they're very comparable at all, aside from the fact that they both regenerate over time. But you know, at
Mm.
that point, it's like very minor similarities.
I think the reason they said is that they're concerned, right? Like they're concerned it's
Yeah,
going to turn into Mortal Kombat where it's like this constant like jump away, keep away, and throwing fireballs. But I mean, Mortal Kombat is a very different game in
yeah, yeah.
general. You know, like I can go on forever. I don't want to sound like I'm hating on Mortal Kombat 11, but they're because it's funny. Mortal Kombat 11 they've tried to like really bring a lot of Street Fighter mechanics into it,
Yeah.
but a lot of it didn't mesh well with like some of the Mortal Kombat mechanics. Like for example, like almost every character has like an air fireball, you know, or like
Yeah.
a projectile, right? And the projectiles don't collide in Mortal Kombat. Since everyone regenerates their offensive meter, you know,
Yeah.
they can just keep away, and the stages are so long and big. And
Hmm.
if you block certain projectiles, the pushback is so far, and there's so much mobility options with like teleports and wall jumping and using the stage interaction. So like even when you get the opponent to the corner, they're not necessarily trapped. You know, whereas in
Hmm.
Street Fighter 6, if you get someone in the corner, you know they're in serious trouble. Unless, there is a character that teleports for free.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. But
So
I mean, like I was saying, I think the biggest difference is the fact that the defense and the offense are unrelated in Mortal Kombat, or
yeah,
like the bars that is, because you can use, for example, some defensive bar to do a roll during wake up or breakaway during a combo, right? And
yeah,
then you can wake up and say you get the opportunity to punish because you correctly rolled or broke away at the correct time,
yeah.
and you still have all the access to your meter burn moves because you still have the offensive bar.
Hmm.
But if you do that in Street Fighter 6, you probably won't be able to do it because you're shared between offense and defense. So that kind of like balances it in that way.
Yeah, I like that. Some people were saying that it was some lazy mechanics in Street Fighter 6 because all the base mechanics are based off of different things from other Street Fighters. You know, like parry.
Mm,
You know, it's not quite the same, but it's based off of it. Drive impact is not quite the same as focus attack, but it's based on it. Drive rush. Drive reversal. OD is
yeah.
exactly the same as EX. But what they were saying in an interview was that adding mechanics to the game that they thought would be really cool, and they tweaked around it, and eventually this drive system just became to be, and
Mm,
that kind of tells us that they weren't thinking, hey, how do we make a really easy mechanic that's easy to understand and help beginners, get the game right away. It was more like, how do we make something like fun for the game and make it more deep and give, players more stuff to, they want to add more mechanics to the game that help characters distinguish themselves or players distinguish themselves from other players. So if we get mirror matches, it's not the same. They're not trying to do the same thing, one player could be really offensive with the drive gauge and one player could be really defensive, if it's like a Ryu mirror match, for
yeah,
example.
absolutely.
So
To me, the mechanics, the drive mechanics, they really look like almost a celebration of the series as a whole. And in general, Street Fighter 6 seems to be that way, where everything is a callback to some other Street Fighter. Like for example, they put in the Easter eggs where the burnout stances are references to the other games, and they're clearly putting a lot of effort into the music. Now they're creating new music, new themes for every character, and I assume that in the future we'll see all the classic teams as well. And there's a lot of references here and there. In general, the Street Fighter 6 as it is now, it feels almost like, in a good way, a mishmash of everything that ever happened in Street Fighter, trying to make something that is very complete. My only concern, I guess, is that because there are this many mechanics, I'm really worried that when the game comes out, one will be just so much better than the others. That's the only one that we'll see. I think Capcom is good enough at balancing games. By now, they kind of proved that they're able to do this, or at least correct their mistakes if they make any. That this is not going to be an issue, but it's still a concern. It is a possibility that that's going to happen. That one mechanic is just going to be so much better than the others that you only want to do that. I think they really are putting some effort into preventing this from happening. I'm sure that that's one of their main concerns as well.
Yeah, I think like where it's at right now seems to be fine. Like this game's been in development for a long time, 4 years by now. So they have been
Hmm.
tweaking around with it a lot already. We just need more information on this drive rush.
Yeah.
That's the one mechanic we're not seeing enough. We need to see how, because it's also a very costly mechanic if you cancel it from a normal 3 bars.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So, that's another reason why we don't see it much. So when we
Hmm.
get the beta, I really want to check out that mechanic as much as possible. But, back to the balance thing, Mir. Whenever someone asks me, how do you want Street Fighter 6 to play before we knew? I really like the ism system and the groove system. But this system is kind of like the same thing, but it's all in one package. And I think it would make it easier to balance when everyone's using the drive gauge, rather
Hmm.
than trying to balance K groove or A groove
Yeah,
individually.
yeah. You have everything together instead.
Yeah, so it's pretty
Yeah.
clever, and you can definitely see the director's footprint in it, Nakayama, because he's like a huge Street Fighter like fanatic. So it's kind of interesting you mentioned that it kind of seems like a celebration of all the games.
Yeah,
'Cause, yeah,
something that I personally wanted for Street Fighter 6 before, again, knowing how it was going to play out, was more interesting ways of using your meter, because I felt like just doing EX or supers was kind of, I don't know. I don't want to say boring, but limiting in a way. And I,
mm,
I really had in mind the idea of multiple levels of supers, Marvel style, and what we ended up getting. But it's actually been more interesting than that, because they decoupled the EX moves or overdrive moves from the super bar and put that on the drive. So
yeah,
you get to use both overdrives and supers at the same time
yeah,
without really, one stepping on the other's toes,
yeah.
which I think is actually like something that I wasn't expecting, and I didn't really think that I would want. But now that I see it, it seems really interesting. Like, I'm pretty happy about that.
hmm I think it's the only way it would work.
Yeah,
Like otherwise
otherwise,
we just
level
simply
one
never
super.
see supers
Yeah.
or ODs. Anyways, we should wrap this up, Mir. Let us know in the comments below, guys. What do you think about the drive gauge system? Do you guys think it's maybe a little too complicated for a lot of players getting into it, or you guys think it's just fine and it's a better way to handle things? And yeah, we'll be back with more discussion videos, especially after I move here, Mir, and get settled in, get
Yeah.
my computer set up again. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, guys, till next time.
See ya.